Okay, well, welcome everybody, and I'm super excited to be here today talking about what is a design brief. Now, for those of you that are not familiar with my work, Ashlyn, welcome on board. I work in the area of design thinking, and strategy. And what I do, I'm setting up this weekly webinar just to touch bases with people that I know have an interest with design thinking, and want to learn more about what is happening, in the environment of strategy and design. My name is Stefano, and today we are live, and is the 3rd, 6th, 2020. Okay, just let me give you a quick introduction of what we are going to see today. Just 4 points, and we try to make it into the hour, and we try to stick with the 4 points that highlight here. First of all, I want to give you a very quick intro to my work, what I do, why I'm setting up these webinars. Second, I want to clarify what design thinking is. I think many of us might have different interpretation of what design thinking is, and I just want to give you my perspective on what design thinking is. Is a mindset, is a process, or is something that you need to take and make it yours? And that probably is most probably the answer that I would suggest to everyone. Then third point, I want to really dig into what is a design brief, and why do we need to draft a design brief. And we are going to see how the design brief belongs to even the pre-step of the design thinking process. Is not even in the process, but is a pre-step that is essential for the success of the design thinking process within any organization. And then we are closing this webinar, giving you an idea on how you can work on a design thinking process remotely. And I think this is becoming more and more interesting for people that are working within an organization, or either they are self-employed and they try to say, oh, my team is actually working remotely these days. How can I apply design thinking? How can I use design thinking with a team that is spread, even if you are in the same city? That at this stage doesn't really change a lot, because you can't see each other, just given the current situation that hopefully will be finishing, will be ending soon. But the reality is that when you discover those tools, you might start to use those remote tools, even if you are able to see each other. And I want just to make some example in there on how companies that I'm collaborating with have started to use remote design thinking tools, and they are loving it for many different reasons. But let's get started with a quick introduction to my work. Well, I am a design strategist. I say, what does that mean? Many times I introduce myself as a design strategist, and people go a little bit, kind of scared, because it's a big name, it's a big title to have. Well, basically what I do, I help organizations to understand what their strategy is. And I think the terminology strategy is very common, is very well understood. What we don't really understand is not how to maintain and reinforce a current strategy, but rather how can we create a new one? And what is happening in the last few years with theories like lean startup methodologies and design thinking, we are actually seeing how there are new theories that help us not only to reinforce a strategy that basically is your way to deliver value to your customer, but rather how can you devise new ways to keep that strategy relevant? And sometimes we use lean startup methodologies that specialize mostly on the innovation side of a strategy, but many times we also have the need. Sometimes it's not a choice. Many companies, when ask me to collaborate with them, is not because they are not able to innovate. The part that is really missing in management is the part that relates to creativity. And design thinking brings creativity to the fore to business. And it's something that is just happening, and is also matching that design approach with the conventional strategic thinking theories that we have seen over time. Okay, now, guys, if you want to use the chat, if you have any question, you can see there is a chat box if you want to say where you're tuning in from. I think most of us are from Ireland, so that it makes me happy to connect with local people. But if you want just to use that chat to work away. So, okay, so what are we going to see today? The second point that I want to introduce here is what is design thinking and why do we need it? Because eventually, many of us, I think, are familiar with the concept of strategic thinking, and we have been using strategic thinking theory for the last, let's say, 30 or 40 years. What we are not really used to are the tools of design. Oh, hi, Gillian from Bristol. Lovely to having you here. And what I want to say here that is really important to start to understand and to clarify what is the difference between the process of design or design thinking and the concept of creating a culture of design. And to my personal experience is that Aisling from Dublin is necessary to understand that in order to set up a successful design thinking process, we need to have both. We need to understand what the process of design is and make it yours. Twist the kind of that design thinking process that was developed somewhere around the world in a famous university and try to understand how can I make that process mine in a way that suits my organization. And then also, how can I become the designer, not of the product or the final service, but rather, how can I become the facilitator of a design environment that enable other people to join my design effort and really moving forward into the design thinking process in a way that we are aligned, that there is a sense of direction. And what I want to start saying here and sharing with you guys is that the way that we experience innovation in many organizations is erratic innovation, is what we have on the left side of this chart. And what you see in there is just a starting point, kind of there is a straight line, and all of a sudden there is kind of turmoil of ideas that come together, and it seems that it's like if we ended up being in a washing machine. Okay, something happened, and then after that, now that process can last 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, depends on the organization where you're working with. And after that messy process, we are exiting the process of innovation with a new idea. Now, that is the way that innovation has been happening up to now in many organizations, and possibly is also the nature of innovation, being a little bit messy and try different things. But that is what I call erratic innovation. But what design really does, and I'm trying to giving you an understanding behind the process of design, is that design try to artificially make this messy process a little bit more linear. Okay. Now, why do I say artificially? Artificially is because we have devised this process. Whoever is trying to facilitate design is trying to say, okay, if that is how innovation works, how can I make it a little bit more linear? The reality is that innovation, when it's disruptive, most of all, and not just incremental, requires a little bit of messiness. But the problem with that is that if that process becomes too much messy, or there is too much serendipity happening within an organization, well, most of the time teams fall apart because a team member pulls on one direction and the other team member pull in the other direction. So what we are doing, and the reason why there is this concept of design thinking as a process, is because what we are trying to do is try to understand what are the steps that an organization can take in order to innovate. And when I say in an organization, I refer really to the people. So the people are the core of creativity and innovation. And the role that design thinking is acquiring in many organizations is getting teams of people together and try to align them in a process that is not as complicated as is the one, or bundle as it is on the left side, and try to make it a little bit more linear. Okay, that I suppose is kind of a visual, can help you try to understand why there is a step-to-step approach to design thinking. It's not just because designer like processes, but just because we want to create a language that is understandable not only by the chief or the person that is responsible for design thinking, but anybody really need to understand where we are in our design thinking journey, and kind of making that linear process really helps. Okay, so having said that, let me outline kind of 4 basic steps of design thinking. Now, there are many different frameworks out there that you can choose for your design thinking process. What I wanted to do is I want to say to these guys 4 basic steps that are at the core of any design thinking process. I said, if I need to refine design thinking to 4 steps, which step would I advise? Well, I think for many of us is clear that design thinking is human-centered. What does it mean is human-centered? That what we need to do is, doesn't matter what we think that might create value for the final user. Human-centered means that we need to observe the people that we want to serve in their native environment and try to see what are the needs that those people have that are not able to tell us about. So basically, design starts with the idea that, yes, we might have an intuition, but rather we need to refine that intuition with the observation that we need to collect, where we are able to collect from the people that we want to serve. Those people have needs, and we try to tackle and try to explore those needs. So observation will be the first point that I would suggest to anybody. Start to go, leave the building, go out, go where the customer or the user is, and try to observe the user and also talk to the user. And let me make here a very important distinction here. What is the difference between observing the user and talking to the user? What we know as designers is that if we ask the user what they want just a better version and maybe even cheaper of the current offer that we deliver them, okay? So most of the time, I personally believe that interviews can only give us some intelligence. I think the real intuition, the real gem that is there already within our customers can only be discovered if we take the time to observe their behavior, okay? That behavior can tell you a lot about the job that they are trying to do, and they don't understand what they actually are trying to achieve. Not because they are stupid, it's just because it's just the way that we are wired as human beings. Sometimes we are not completely aware of what is the challenge that we are facing. So what I'm trying to say that what we are trying really to achieve is what is called, or uncover, is the unarticulated customer need. If you, from a strategy perspective, are only trying to serve an unmet customer need, a need that is obvious, but nobody is tackling, well, I suppose you are ready strategically in a head-to-head competition with your competitor in trying to solve something that is difficult to solve, but there is someone else already that is trying to solve that or trying to solve that. So really, observation is really uncovering those needs that are not obvious, let's say. So what do we do after we observe our user? Well, we try to come up with some possible concept or solution that fit that need that we have observed in the customer. And obviously the question, and guys, if you have any question, please use the chat and I will tailor my presentation based on your observation. Why we postpone ideation after the observation phase? For the simple reason that what we want in there is an ideation that is data-driven. And now I want to make an important point here. When people go back to a company, go to the CEO or maybe higher level of management and say, oh, we should follow a design thinking approach, there is the perception in higher level of management that design is a waste of time, is only for designers. The reality is that now anyone should be familiar with the concept of design, because design really gives us that possibility to explore unfamiliar terrain that conventional strategic thinking lacks. Okay, strategic thinking helps you a lot on in the analytical part of things, but is really lacking on the creative part. So ideation, the way that we see that into design, is an ideation that is not just coming, out of the blue, but is something that is based on a set of observation and data that we have collected. So it's data driven. So anybody that is trying to stopping you and try to develop a design thinking agenda, say, this is not a waste of time. I'm collecting data. The difference between the conventional way to do strategy and the way that we create new strategy with design is the type of data. The type of data that we use is qualitative. So we try to understand the user in depth. So we don't rely on 200,000 interviews, but rather maybe in 10, 15 interviews that tells us a lot about those unarticulated customer needs. And that I find personally that part is very, very fascinating. Make companies more aware of the needs of their users rather than seeing their user only from a kind of a number perspective. So my customer is 22 and a half years old, I have 2.5 children. That is very important later on when we need to try to understand the size of the market and the impact that we can have. And that I'm not saying that is not important. But if we start with that type of data, we will end up with incremental thinking rather than is a thinking that really enable us to tackle those unarticulated needs. And if you look any successful organization, innovation, rarely happens within big organization. Happens because there is either an entrepreneur or an intrapreneur that is able to spot a need in the customer. But why they are able to do so? Because they spend time with their customers. And if you're not sure you're familiar, but now we have CEOs spending times at the reception desk of big hotel or hospital and try to understand how the life of the customer is. Before, there was a huge gap between, high-level management and the customer. I think more and more companies are getting this because it seems obvious, but the reality is that some companies have start to understand the impact that design thinking can bring, other companies a little bit less. But I think it's only a matter of time that more and more companies will acquire that mindset. Now, what happened after we have observed and we have kind of come up with a different way to do things? Well, what is really important then, we need to prototype and test. Well, prototyping and test is a concept that is not too difficult to understand, but that many companies fail to put in practice. What they do, rather than creating a very cheap prototype, they start creating a working prototype. So what is happening? That you have innovation that is becoming expensive. What happens if you are through the innovation journey and you only keep prototyping and testing at the end, that your innovation is possibly starting to cost you a lot without having, in a way, verified that there is the need for what you do. And in fact, many companies really go belly up, not because they are not able to deliver the product, but because there is no demand for it. So what design thinking does very well, beside making us more creative, is say, okay, if that is your intuition based on data, how can you make the customer part of your innovation process? And we know that the sooner we invite the customer and the users in our design thinking process, the more we de-risk our innovation effort. And that, I think, when we try to sell that concept to higher level management, is very important, that we clarify that design de-risk the innovation effort of any organization. But that is enough. I think we clearly understand observation, ideation, prototyping, and testing. But now let me tell you that there is a level deeper of kind of these 4 levels. And what I want to show you here is how there is a difference between the creative part of design and the innovation side of design. What happened in the first 2 steps? We are using creativity. What ultimately we try to do is, given the observation that we are able to generate with our users, we try to shift the perception of what our service is. And many, even university experts say that design is a problem-solving method. For me, more than is also a problem-solving, but that is into prototyping and testing, is the innovation part. What is even more important to me is that design is a problem-finding technique or method. What does it mean, problem-finding? That help us to refine our understanding of the problem. And that is a part that I think many of us struggle to understand. The power of design is not in the prototyping and testing. Yes, there is some value in there, but I think if you take lean startup methodologies, all they do really help you to iterate your idea fast and cheap. Okay. The biggest contribution of design is not telling you that you need to start prototyping and cheap with a paper prototype. Later on, you have the Wizard of Oz prototype where there is somebody moving parts. And then eventually you ended up having a fully work prototype, and then you go alpha and beta testing or whatever. I think the contribution of design is that enables us to see the problem from a different perspective. And by changing our perception, then new opportunity for disrupting innovation really start to happen. Now, what is the problem if you're only prototyping and testing without doing the creative work, without doing the observation? That most probably you won't be really changing the core of your offer, but rather you make your offer a little bit more relevant to your user. That is good. I'm not saying that is not good, but is not what design is for. And just because I like this example, I always use the example of, think about Gillette, the razor company. As you can see, I use that a lot. Now, when they experience a drop in sales, they do a lot of prototyping and tests. And what they ended up doing is adding a blade to their razors. Now, the problem with that is that, as long as I know, there are already 5 blades. So the problem is, you start to understand there is the end of incremental innovation. In order to overcome the incremental innovation limit, well, you need to shift your perception about what does it mean shaving. How can I enable Stefano to shave without using a razor? And that is exactly what design does well. What is the problem that Stefano is trying to solve? Another very simple example, and that comes from a tool in design that is called the job to be done. Imagine that you're trying to hang a painting on your wall, okay? Do you really need a drill? Well, you need a drill because you need to make a hole. The point is that the user, whoever your customer or your user, doesn't care about the drill. What the customer wants, the job to be done, is having that picture, that frame, that painting on the wall. Now, obviously, now the best offer that we have to give to our user is the drill. But the reality, we should not think incrementally about creating a better drill. We can continuously doing that just to keep our strategy going. But eventually, the company that will succeed might be in a completely different industry than being in drilling. Why? Because could be maybe a stronger plastic stick components that we just put on the wall, and then we can use that to hold our painting. So the job to be done in there is not really a hole, but rather the job to be done is having the painting or whatever it is on the wall. So that is kind of what design thinking does very well. Help us to find new ways that serve the customer in a way that is sustainable for the customer, and also maybe making their experience much better. Because I mean, at the end of the day, drilling is not a great experience. If I can have any other solution for me that enables me to have the job to be done, my painting on the wall, I will be much more happy with that solution. But obviously, it's not that easy. I think there are companies that are trying to do this, but I think the problem is not that we don't have the technology to do that. It's just maybe they didn't shift the mindset in the right way. Okay, now, if there is not question, if you have any question, please, or if you have other example that you will use, you can normally use in order to describe incremental and disrupting innovation, you can please use the chat box to highlight them. Now, what I want to do now is going really to the third point and try to understand, why do we need a design brief? First of all, what is a design brief? And at what stage of the design process we really need to develop a design brief? And in order to explain what the design brief is, I need to take a second here to see how the role of the designer has changed over time. If you think about design and design thinking in the 70s and the 80s, but through the 90s, the job of the designer was the genius, the one that came up with all the different suggestions for the final product or service. And, you can recall many names when you think about disrupting innovation and how these people really change the computer industry or the automobile industry. The point is that the company was relying on one or two people to do all the difficult creative work, and all the other people in the company were just implementers. Okay, and that is unfortunately the way that many organizations still perceive innovation happening within an organization. My point of view and what is happening in the field of design, that we are shifting from innovation 1.0 to innovation 2.0, and say, what the heck is that? Well, it's not rocket science. It means that now we don't see the designer as the designer of the product or the service, but rather we see the designer as facilitator that creates the right environment and the right culture for design to happen. So you see, it's a shift from thinking about designing as somebody that is creating the prototype and have the vision of how the final product will look like. We know now that design, what is really important within an organization, is that person that creates the environment that is a safe learning environment for everybody to come in and contribute with their intelligence on how the product could change or how a new product can be developed. And what we really understood, that innovation is a team sport. And the only way that we can make innovation happen within an organization is really starting that conversation and invite others to contribute with their thinking and their understanding. The reality is that many organizations, people working within many organizations, not only are not involved in the strategy making of the organization, but they are scared to foster new ideas, to propose new ideas, for the simple reason that maybe the management never invited the people in the front line in touch with the user to say, oh, well, what do you think? How do you think we could improve the experience for the final user? And I think now time is right for making this to happen. And in order to change that, we need to change the culture. We need to change the way that we think about innovation, about creativity. And I think nowadays the difference is that we have the tool. And many more companies are kind of open for this to happen. So the barriers to implementing a design thinking agenda within your organization, I think, are coming down. But even if you are a starting entrepreneur, I think before we were thinking that the innovators were the people that had, a degree in psychology, that understand the user, or people that have studied design in terms of art design. But what we start to understanding now, it doesn't matter if you study art or not. Sometimes if you look the best innovators, they didn't even go to the third level education. Why? Because they kept that innovation that is within ourselves. When we were born, we are very creative. And later on, what happened is that schools normalize our behavior and kind of to reduce that creative effort. So in a way, all my job is deschooling people. But the reality is that knowledge is important. But when it comes to design, ignorance is even more important. So acknowledging what you don't know and try to find a way to cope with it, I think is even more important. So becoming that facilitator of design, I think, is becoming a unique resource that will be more and more valuable over time. Okay, so if we have seen the 4 steps of the design thinking process, what are we exploring today? Well, the part that we are exploring today is part of the top part of this chart and is still in the pre-step of the design thinking process. And the template that we are going to see today is the one highlighted with the black arrow, and is basically a template that enables us to try to understand what is the overall project that we are placing together. What is kind of the brief that we can give to other people when somebody asks you, what do you do? What project are you doing? Well, in our mind, we need to have a place where to place some information about what we are doing. Now, the 2 steps that precede the design brief was, first of all, try to understand the opportunity. So there is a template in there on my website, stefanomessori.com, that is called the Design Opportunity Template. And also there is another pre-step that is called the Project Scope Template. Those 2 templates really enter and are part of the design brief template. That is, while you can skip the first 2, you can't really skip the design brief template, because anytime you propose an idea, unless you propose that idea in a way that is clear to you, other people won't get it. So in order to become the facilitator of design, you need to have in mind that bringing clarity to your design thinking process is essential. And on top of that, if you look anytime that a product succeeds, or a service or a company, is because the secret of design is simplicity. And that is the part that takes most out of us. How can I simplify that idea? And the example that I use there is like Michelangelo. The job that Michelangelo was doing when he was seeing a block of marble, say, well, I just need to take away the part that I don't need. And you as a designer have to do exactly the same job. And you need to invite the other people in your team to help you to remove the part that you don't need. Okay. So this is we still in the pre-step of the design thinking process. If we move to observation, and possibly I will explain that next week in the next webinar, we are going into creating poster, creating personas, and creating customer journey mapping. And then into ideation is where we invite an external team of people that are not part of the core team of the project that we are working, and try to harness their intelligence in order to refine our thinking about our new product or service. Okay, so if we are now talking about the design brief template, what are the basic components of any design brief template? Well, the first step that I would say that it seems obvious, and that I suppose is what is being done when there is any new initiative, doesn't matter if it is design or not, but really you need to come up with the description. What is the overall understanding of your project today? So you need to give the people that you want to, I would say, collaborate with in this project, to come out with an overall description of your design thinking process. And could be just 5 or 6 lines of text. And also I would suggest, because design is also a very visual discipline, we might also use some graphic in order to explain what we are trying to do. But basically, is just a very short paragraph on what we are trying to do. It's kind of a sort of a little bit more complex version of your elevator pitch when you're trying to pitch something to your boss or maybe even to your colleagues. Say, oh, I see an opportunity in that. But you need to be kind of able to refine and to use the right words. And design really asks us as designers to really start to weight each word that we use. Remember, words can communicate a lot. And when we can't use words to communicate it, we need to go out of language and use graphics. So after we describe briefly what our opportunity or challenge we are pursuing, we really need to be focused on the second point, that is the target user. And out of these 7 points, the target user is the one that is more important. And that goes back to the understanding that design is human-centered. Now, if you change the users halfway through your design thinking process, well, you need to start from scratch. Why? Because the first step of the design thinking, that is observation. If you observe the people that you want to serve, and really you realize that your idea, that your intuition that you have is not really supported by the research, there is no point to go forward in your design thinking process, but rather go back, reassess, change the description, and then go to the target user and try to assess again those unarticulated set of needs. Okay, so the target user is the core point of any design thinking process. Okay, then let's say that you have chosen a target segment, and let me tell you that most of the time I see design thinking process failing because they go for a target user that is a little bit too broad. So what happened is that the result of the interviews are kind of a little bit all over the place. So it means that you didn't focus enough on the target user that you want to serve. So anytime that you start a design thinking process, have a look on my website. You can find the project scope template that helps you try to kind of narrow down to what we call personas, a set of users that you think have something in common. And really the scoping your project is very important. So in order to scope a project, you can use both realities as kind of the target user in terms of the persona. What are the psychographic characteristics of that user? Most of the time, let me be honest, we don't use what we have been using in strategy that are basically dimension like age, location, preferences in terms of food or whatever, but rather what we use is what I call psychographic and not demographics. What does it mean? That relates more to the attitude of those people towards your product rather than the actual age group in which they are. The problem with the type of research that just look at the age group and sex income level is that they tell you that there are 25% of people that behave that way, but they don't tell you the why. As designers, we want to know the why. We are curious. We want to go a level deeper, a deeper level, trying to understand why that person is behaving that way. And you know what is the funny thing? That sometimes you can find two users in two different age groups that have the same need. And that tells you a lot on how we are moving away, at least in the observation phase, from those assumptions that we have about people, their age group, their income level, and try to understand what is really motivating them to behave in a way rather than in another one. Okay? Now, what is really important that also we start to understand what are the limitations that we as an organization or as an individual we face in that design thinking process, okay, in tackling that that challenge or enhancing an opportunity for the user? Well, everybody faces limitation. Thinks about the budget. That is the obvious limitation that I think about. We have only 20,000 euros budget for our project. So it's better that we use every penny that we put in our design thinking process need to be spent, appropriately. So think about, the part that start to be expensive is prototyping and testing. So before spending money in a working prototype, it's better that you start to think, okay, can I use a paper prototype? Can I use a prototype that doesn't really cost me anything? Because in that, again, you are de-risking your innovation effort. The second most common limitation is time. So basically, you have a limited time for delivering, at least coming up with an outcome for your project. And the third one, very important, is the core team working in that design thinking process, okay, in that process of design. And that is very important because this reminds me to highlight the importance of having two teams. So one team is really involved completely in the design thinking process, and people are working that as main part of their work. And that normally is a team that I would suggest between 4 and 5 people. I can give you 6, but the problem is that it starts to be very big when you reach 6 people. I would say 4 to 5 people is the right number for the core team. And then you need to have another team that I call the extended team, that are people that somehow can assist the core team because they are very knowledgeable in that particular, product or service, or they are very knowledgeable about the user. So you want to kind of harness their intelligence, but they are not working full time. So they might work even in a different industry. But let's say that you had a colleague working in your organization for many years, and later on they move in another completely different industry. But you want to get these people because they know how the industry evolved, how the other competitors maybe are trying to innovate. So we need a set of people that are not in our core team, but they can bring that intelligence. And an activity that we do during we perform during the design thinking process is called setting up your art gallery. And that, in few words, is try to displaying the result of your research that you have collected in step 1 in the observation phase. And rather than writing, reports, we create persona, customer journey mapping. We display them in a room, and we invite this extended team to have a look at it and try to say, what can you see? What do you see in there that I'm not able to see it? And that there is another important point here to take down notes, is that when you are working into a design thinking process, you always welcome external contributor, because even without knowing, you start to be a little bit biased towards a way of thinking. And design is not really a fan of that part. We try to make sure that we keep our independence in the way that we think, and not getting a little bit biased in one direction rather than another one. So the distinction between the internal team and the external team is very important. And another reason why we have an external team is that sometimes organizationally, what happened within the core team, let's say that you have 4 players, they might start to develop different point of view on how the project should develop. And having an external team to invite in our conversation really help to balance those kind of, I would say, tension that naturally generates within the team. So that is another reason why having an external team can really help us. But moving forward, the next step are try to understand, you and your team, what are the questions that you don't have an answer yet in your project. So obviously we know what we know. We know that we have enough information for that particular point and the other point. But if it is really innovative, what you are doing, you have some question that you lack that data or that piece of information. So in your design brief, you need to write down the question that you don't have an answer yet. Why you need to do that? because that will really inform your thinking through the design thinking process. And remember, the design brief is like your North Star for your project. What happened that along the way, you are moving towards observation, you're moving towards creation. Every time that there is a little bit of a conflict, you go back to design brief. That is kind of your first understanding of the project. But we said that we were going to do that. But obviously, through the design thinking process, you get more information. You refine your understanding of the project. And then what happens that even your North Star need to be updated. And we will see how the design brief through the design thinking process become more as a design criteria. That is something that helps you to evaluate. Is my idea then really good? Is not good? Should I change a few parts? And remember that design is iterative. You don't have all the answer in day one, but you need to have a brief that keeps you, working in a direction. Otherwise, what happens that divergent thinking will overcome convergent thinking. So you're trying to please everyone, and you don't really have that focus that is required in design thinking. So basically, what are those questions that you need to ask to your users or even to the extended team because you don't have enough intelligence today to answer? And the last 2 points are very connected. One are the outcomes, expected outcomes, and one are the metrics. Very briefly, the outcomes. Anytime you start a design thinking brief, a design thinking process, you need to ask yourself, what is my expected outcome? Why am I doing this? I'm doing this, yes, because obviously there is a kind of revenue for the organization, and that is fine. But what we really try to do in design is try to understand what is the impact of the user life. And we need to say, we need to start to write down day one, what is our expected impact, both financial, but also societal impact that we can bring into our communities. Now, it's not easy. It's not easy at this level where we are in the pre-step of the design thinking process. Don't think that you are right, but just do it because it will inform and will refine itself. But you need to have a starting point. Without a starting point, you are not able to create that alignment that is needed in your design thinking process. And the last point, again, is the metrics. What are the metrics that we are going to use in order to make sure that we are measuring the impact that we have in with our customer correctly? So some metrics can be financial, could be a growth metrics that you apply. And remember that design thinking, though, many metrics that we can use are what I call below the surface. Is something, for example, you remember when I was saying, we as design are trying to create a design culture within our organization. So that is always a metrics that I place in my design thinking process. How much the people, both internally in our organization, but also our users, shifted toward a design approach. That is not something, that is not an outcome metrics, but is a metrics that really enables you to understand how is your journey as an individual, but also as a team working in your organization, is in order to become better, more, I would say, design driven. And that are kind of metrics that maybe CEOs don't care, but really that can make the difference in the day-to-day work of any organization. So that kind of, in a nutshell, tells you what are the part of the design brief. What are the components of any successful design thinking process in day one? You need to be very clear on the description, the user that you want to serve, the scope, the limitation, the question that you need to find an answer, the outcomes, and the metrics. My bet, if you go and propose to use design thinking within your organization and you are clear on those points, the chances is that most probably when they see that you are clear and you go there with a very well articulated brief, it's very difficult that somebody can turn you down. They can always happen, say there is no budget or there is no, and say, well, the design thinking process really try to minimize the budget for creating a new product, and also the risk that the innovation. So I would say if you try to take the time at the beginning and try to answer those questions, really will inform all the rest of the design thinking process. But obviously, as I was saying before, innovation is not a solo sport, but rather is a team sport. So given the current environment, we might need to collaborate with our team member remotely. So I want just to spend the last 10 minutes in this webinar on showing you some tools that I use in order to get companies and their team members to collaborate remotely in a design thinking process. Okay, so anytime that we speak about design, we have two types of tools. As we have seen in the design thinking process, there is one part that is creative and one part that is innovating. Okay, so if you look at the left side of this visual, you can see a tool that I use in order to run creative session. And I just type here, for those of you that are not familiar, one is Mural, mural.co, and the other one is, there is another tool that is called Miro.com. Now, the difference between the two, for those of you that want to create a free account, Miro, actually, there is a free tier. In Mural, that is personally my favorite, there is not a free tier. But if you want to give it a go, Miro.com really can help you. Now, another difference between the two is that in the free tier of Miro, doesn't really enables you to invite guests. So everyone needs to have an account. With Mural, you can invite people to collaborate with you, even though if they don't have an account. So sometimes it's easier. Imagine me that working with different customers in a specific design thinking session, creative session. I don't force them to create an account, but rather I send them a link and they are able to collaborate with me in this platform. Okay, so the way that, for example, this is kind of my way to work, is just creating a mural. So the mural that you see in front of you is basically 2.5 meters wide and basically 2 meters tall. So when you see that in the size of your screen, but the reality is a huge poster, and you can also print it if you like it. But what we can do with these tools is really creating an environment where people feel welcome to join in and place their sticky notes. And I want to share this with a real mural that I have in my screen. And I just share my screen here for a second so you can see how that will look like. And you should be able to give it a second. You should be able, now just take a second, the software. So now in there, you can see that basically is just a big poster in front of you, and you are able to zoom in and to zoom out. And you see how in this mural, really, I'm trying to start from the people. I would say the team, 4 or 5 people. So you actually, as a facilitator, need to prepare this in advance of the meeting and enable people to try to understand how the mural work. So obviously, for this particular platform, you need to go on the left side, take a sticky note, and from there, you can write on the sticky notes. Okay? So basically, what we want people to do, to write their name, their role within the organization or our team. And now in this case, you can see exactly the template that I just introduced. And in there, we kind of leave about half an hour time for anyone of our team to go through the design brief template alone, okay? Because that is kind of time that they need to familiarize with the concept of the design brief. What we want to do after, though, is coming together as a team and start to put together all the different post-its, the different ideas regarding the different part of this design thinking process. Why we are taking the time of doing this? is because when I work with organization, one thing that I can tell you, halfway through the design thinking process, if you bring there and say, can we do actually a design brief? Well, you come up with 10 different answers for each part of the design brief. So basically, there is no alignment. Different team members that might be very smart individually are not aligned. They are working on the same project, but they perceive the project satisfying different customer needs or different customer personas. That is the reason why I took the time to say, guys, anytime you're setting up a design brief, a design thinking process, take the time to align your team before starting the observation. Because in the observation phase, you need to be fair on who you are going to interview, the people that you want to have an impact. Okay, so we take, let's say this takes longer. This part of the design thinking, the design brief, exchanging the ideas, try to create sense around those ideas might take up to 1.5 hours. So every team member needs to have the time to introduce his or her ideas. And we close the session, try to find clusters of ideas that are emerging. So basically, we are looking for patterns. So from my observation and your observation and someone else's observation, can we actually come up with a unique, with only one design brief that kind of put together all the different intuition that we had, in this work together. So this was just kind of I wanted to give you a little bit of an understanding on how we can use these remote tools, and minds that, you can join in, doesn't matter where you are, and even the time zone, because anybody can, obviously for the first part, anybody can work on the design briefly independently. Now, the second part, when people start to express their preferences or they post it in the design brief, obviously you need this platform and you need a meeting software where need to be, simultaneous. And also the third point of this template need to be simultaneous. But the first part, you can set up a mural or a Miro poster, let's say 1 week, and leave your team member 1 week time to work on that part of the design thinking process, writing down their own personal understanding of how the design brief is. So what is the customer that we are trying to serve? What is the impact that we are trying to achieve? What are the outcomes, expected outcomes? What are the metrics? But this is all good. That is very creative, but all of this is useless unless we put a time frame into it. What does it mean? That innovation and creativity need to have deadlines in order to work. Now, that goes back to the understanding that design is just a waste of time. It's just, artistic and doesn't really work. The way that I see design is project-based. What does it mean? That there are responsibilities, there are accountabilities. Obviously, the team need to be aligned. So the tool that I would suggest for those of you that maybe are not using this yet in your design thinking process is what I call a project management. And let me share my screen again. That looks pretty much like a Kanban-like project management, where you have the different part. Basically, you lay out for each set of tasks the different step of your design thinking process. So there is step 1, step 2, step 3. And what you are doing in there is taking, for example, the design brief template, and you start from the description, okay? Now, in this tab, you can delegate that to a particular team member. And if you want to add more team members, you can add team members. But what is really important is that there is the starting date and the due date. And this is absolutely essential. Let's say that you are going to meet with your team the 5th of June, and you put a deadline, and people can start to write their comment in here. Say, have a look at the mural because I added some new observation. Or if there is a comment that they want to make into the scope, or if they want to, let's say they find some data in there that is relevant, they can add an attachment in there. So basically, it's a way to keep your project moving forward, setting deadlines and sharing document. And while this is much more project-oriented, the Mural is more creativity-oriented. But let me close this webinar because we are approaching the end of the webinar, that any successful design thinking process require both. Require the creative part that needs to use a visual platform like Mural or Miro, but also need project management behind it, okay? So if this is true, what is the lesson that we have learned today? Hopefully, if hopefully I was able to communicate this to all of you guys in a way that is understandable, is that we are moving from the understanding of design as we are doing everything. We are the designer, we know exactly how the product will look like, and we shift from that understanding to become the facilitator. So we need to start to familiarize ourselves with the collaboration tools like Mural, like the project management online, like, for example, the most famous, I think, is Trello, but there is also Asana. There are many different project management, and maybe your organization use an internal project management system, so you can use that. And basically, what you're trying to do in there, you are trying to create an online space where people can connect and start to work on your design brief, in this case, before the session. So really, the only reason why we need to meet up, even online, is because we did all the homework and we come together to share that with the other people. There is no point wasting half an hour in a meeting if everyone is working independently. Do this at home, and when you come to the meeting, share it. So we need to create those collaboration tools, and also we need to communicate, with our team members and say, guys, we are going to meet at that time. These are the links to the different platforms that we are using, and these are a set of instructions that you need to follow. So communication when we work remotely in design is absolutely essential. And then after that, we have to facilitate the session. And that is kind of an art in a way. I'm still getting used to it, because you need to be the one that facilitate. So you become the conduit for the conversation, but you are not the broadcaster. So you're not doing all the talking, but rather you facilitate the conversation. And the most difficult trick in there is to make the people, the team members, invited to share their observation rather than to be scared. Oh, I might say something wrong. We need to set that safe learning environment where there is not right or wrong. Mostly in creativity, there is no right or wrong. Any idea can eventually be refined and can be implemented in a way that is not clear at the beginning. So a problem that I see most of the time in design is that you have some people that are into divergent thinking, so they are not afraid to say, okay, I have millions of ideas. Other people that are much more analytical are in convergent thinking. So your role of facilitator, that depending on the design thinking, which part of the design thinking process you need to say, guys, this session is we are using divergent thinking. And when it needs to converge, say, guys, okay, now we come all together, we bring the idea together. What we have learned today is 1, 2, 3. And guess what? Where do you place the 1, 2, 3 that we have learned into the project management system? So what you do, you finish your lesson, your meeting with your team, with a very clear understanding of who is responsible for the different part of the design thinking process, and if there are deadlines, and how the next meeting will look like based on the outcome of the previous meeting. So guys, I hopefully didn't bother you too much. If you have any question, me is done. I just went out 5 minutes of the session, but hopefully you had grasped some notion about design. How can you working remotely and inform your thinking about the potential of using design thinking remotely? And mostly today was on the design brief. So I'm not sure how many of you already are familiar with the design brief, but I really suggest anybody of you to start to familiarize with the design brief, with the different parts, and try to see how you feel with it, and try to give it your best shot. And most of all, invite your colleagues into it, and see what they think about it, and and how do you think you can work with them. Okay, folks, listen, thank you very much. Hopefully there was something, this has been informative, and thank you for taking the time and spending this hour together. So listen, happy design thinking, and I'll see you next week. Cheers.